is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Warnings of a global economic crisis. Chinese President Xi Jinping hosts the leaders of Russia, Brazil, India and South Africa.
Our other headlines: the worst earthquake in Afghanistan for decades kills over 1,000 people. Many others are feared trapped in the rubble.
UK inflation hits 9.1%. Prices are rising at their fastest rate for 40 years. Food, energy and fuel costs are to blame.
We are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down, and we're moving expeditiously to do so.
Markets breathe a sigh of relief as the US Fed says it's committed to bringing down inflation.
And open skies. The Berlin Air Show is back after a 4-year break as the industry grapples with a new post-pandemic world.
The world economy is close to crisis. That's the warning from China's President Xi Jinping. He was speaking at the Brics forum of major emerging economies, including Russia, India, Brazil and South Africa.
President Xi again called for an end to economic sanctions. It's the first summit of its kind with Vladimir Putin since the invasion of Ukraine began. Our correspondent Dong Shui was listening to President Xi's speech.
The president stressed that to reach out to each other and jointly promote sustainable global development, tide over difficulties and pursue win-win cooperation. BRICS members should be inclusive and jointly expand openness and integration. He said, and I quote, "We in the international community should reject zero-sum games and jointly oppose hegemonism and power politics. We should also build a new type of international relations based on mutual respect, fairness, justice, and win-win cooperation," unquote. You know, the BRICS leaders, Russian President Vladimir Putin, Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa all delivered speeches via video, with most of them calling for more cooperation among members. They also shared for boosting and reducing barriers to international trade.
Dong Shui reporting from Beijing. Isabel Hilton is the founder of China Dialogue. I asked her how these emerging economies will be affected by the war in Ukraine and by fears of a global recession.
BRICS countries are affected as much, if not more than the rest of the world. I mean, we have one member of BRICS that's invaded a sovereign country, and that makes the rest of the world ask what the other members really think, especially since the impacts of that invasion in energy price spikes, in food shortages, and in what is now widely predicted recession will inevitably hit some BRICS members very hard. And Brazil is not going to do very well. South Africa probably won't do very well. India is currently the fastest growing economy in the world, but there are certainly clouds on the horizon with a global recession for India too. So if BRICS plans were to support sustainable development and the Paris Agreement, as they proudly declared in 2019, those plans are really very much off course.
And you mentioned some of the fallout caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The problems to world trade will be a key issue. Are we expecting any significant moves from BRICS on this?
I think it's quite difficult for BRICS to make a lot of impact on that. You may see some bilateral deals on Paris, but there's a structural problem with BRICS in terms of having a major effect on international trade, and that's because although BRICS represents 3 billion people and it's got a combined GDP of $16 trillion, and that is undoubtedly big, the problem is that it's not big as a bloc. So all the members are very different. They don't have a lot of synergies between them, and they don't have the kind of coherence as a group to allow them to exercise very solid economic power. So for example, if you look at how they trade with each other, China's trade with South Korea is bigger than the whole of its trade with Brics members. China's trade with the European Union or the United States, again, is very much bigger. So, China's trade with the rest of the world is 12 times higher than its trade with the Brics. So it's very difficult to exercise a meaningful power as a trade bloc with that kind of disparity. And there are other problems, including the fact that, for example, Brazil is a member of Mercosur, and members of Mercosur can't do trade deals. They have to do a trade deal as a bloc. So again, to operate as Brics, Mercosur would have to have separate trade deals with each of the Brics members.
And we have another potential new member of Brics in the shape of Argentina, with the support of China and of Brazil. What are the pros and cons of expanding Brics?
I think Argentina would like to be aligned with what is, the foremost grouping of emerging economies. Argentina itself is yet again in big economic trouble. And the difficulty with expanding Brics is that it operates by consensus, and not everyone is as keen as China on the expansion. India's got quite a lot of reservations. Brazil, despite, ostensibly supporting Argentina, doesn't really want to see its own position within Brics diluted. So I think there will be a lot of, expressions of goodwill, but unless we get a serious agreement on a rewritten set of rules where it doesn't have to operate in the same way by consensus, and that's a very different organization, I think it's going to be quite slow and tricky.
A powerful earthquake in Afghanistan has killed at least 1,000 people and injured hundreds more.
Rescuers are still trying to reach many of those affected in remote and mountainous regions in the country's southeast. The epicenter of the 5.9 magnitude quake was near the city of Khost, close to the Pakistan border, but tremors were felt as far away as India.
Well, Tawab Zafarzai is a freelance journalist in Kabul.
Earthquake happened at 2:20 a.m. Last night. So the casualties are more because everybody was home and everybody was sleeping, and most of the construction in those areas are mud-made homes. That's why the destruction is more after the earthquake. And as I got in contact with the locals this afternoon, they said that there are hundreds and hundreds of more people trapped under those damaged homes, and the death toll will raise even up to above 2,000 people.
It's an extraordinary amount of deaths. Can you give us a sense of how large an area is affected?
At least 4 major districts in Paktika and 1 district in Khost. In that sense, you can see that hundreds and hundreds of thousands people are living in those districts. The damage of that quake is more because if you compare it to the cities, because more mud-built houses are there. That's why the casualties are bigger.
Before this earthquake, Afghanistan was already in a fragile state. How well equipped is government and the relief agencies to deal with this latest emergency?
Well, it's almost impossible for the current government to deal with such incidents, because lately in this week, so many floods in so many provinces, floods came, and the government is incapable to rescue those people. So how can they manage without any professionals to run those helicopters and to go rescue people? They are lacking professionals, they are lacking funds. That's why it's quite difficult for the rescue management team.
Russian forces have pounded Ukraine's second-largest city of Kharkiv with rockets, killing at least 20 people.
The intensified shelling comes after weeks of relative calm in the region. All this as fighting continues in the main battlefield city of Severodonetsk in the east.
Well, our correspondent Michael Voss is in the capital, Kyiv. Michael, what more do we know about these rocket attacks in Kharkiv?
Jamie, it does appear as if Russian troops are trying to move once again towards the second city, Kharkiv. Back at the start of the conflict, they reached the outskirts of the city and then got pushed back all the way back into Russia. There's now some very heavy Russian shelling going on across the border into villages and other communities on the Ukrainian side. As you say, we're hearing reports of at least 20 people killed, including children. The city itself is out of artillery range, but it is being hit once again by missiles. The Ukrainians think that this is a Russian move to try and stop Ukraine from sending reinforcements from this area down to the east, where the real heavy fighting is going on. Now, they're in Severodonetsk. The Russians and separatists control the city. The Ukrainians and some civilians are in this giant chemical plant. It's to a degree a stalemate. There's very heavy shelling going on, very little progress on either side, though the Russians are moving up from the north. When they'd finally taken Mariupol, some of those forces are moving up, trying to encircle the Ukrainian forces around the Severodonetsk area. The other bit of news is that there are reports of a drone attack on a Russian oil refinery inside Russia. The Ukrainians haven't confirmed it. We've seen on social media pictures of quite a large fire at this refinery, and apparently the regional governor in Rostov says they have seen fragments of Ukrainian drones.
Michael, the United Nations says around a third of Ukrainians have now been forced from their homes. You've been speaking to some of those families affected. What did they tell you?
Jamie, it isn't just the trauma of having to leave your home and almost all of your possessions. It's also divided families. Now, when I was in Ukraine in March, in Lviv, I visited a couple from Irpin who'd had to flee the shelling there with their 2 children. But they'd had to leave their elderly grandparents behind. Now that I'm in Kyiv, I went out to Irpin to see the grandparents, to see how they had coped. This is what I found.
Irpin was on the front line when back in February the Russians tried to take the capital, Kyiv, leaving much of the town destroyed by Russian shelling. Retired salesman Volodymyr Petrov lived through it all.
I wasn't afraid for myself, but for my family, for the children, for my son and my daughter-in-law. It affected me personally.
Petrov's children and grandchildren managed to flee, crossing Irpin's makeshift bridge to safety, joining millions of Ukrainians escaping the fighting. I met them in March in Lviv, sheltering with a distant relative. I just want to go home, 11-year-old Alexander told me back then. The Petrovs, though, decided to stay.
Why didn't you leave when you had the chance, when your grandchildren left?
We didn't leave because we decided to stay from the start. We had dogs which we didn't want to leave alone. Many people killed their dogs and we didn't want to do so.
Once the shelling started, the extended family took shelter in the basement.
For 2 months we stayed in the basement. To keep warm, I had to boil water to put bottles between our legs so that we could sleep until morning and wake up to find ourselves alive.
It was very hard in the basement. It was very cold in there. There was no water, no lights, no gas, no nothing. We were there with the candles and flashlights.
Initially, their son's family joined them in the basement. Back in Lviv, they told me about the day Russian troops found them there.
3 Russian soldiers went down to the basement, pointed their guns at us, and asked us to go upstairs. Then they started checking our passports.
He told me the Russians threatened to kill them if they had American visas. Luckily, they didn't.
Then they pushed the children back into a basement and made our parents go upstairs. I didn't know what would happen to my mom and dad. This was when I was really terrified.
It was their granddaughter Stefania's 14th birthday the day we visited, and they could only wish her greetings from afar. Like so many divided families in Ukraine, the pain of separation is hard to bear.
Like so many families, this tragic flow of people is still continuing to this day. All that heavy fighting and shelling in the eastern part of Ukraine, we're seeing yet more evacuations. It's mainly women and children and the elderly. The men are staying behind to fight, but it's the elderly and the infirm and the poor who feel they have nowhere to go are staying in these towns and villages being shelled, and they're the ones who are dying.
Our correspondent Michael Voss in Kyiv.
Russia has been marking the anniversary of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. President Putin laid flowers to honour the war dead at a ceremony in Moscow. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Stuart Smith, who's in Moscow, and a reminder that correspondents in Russia are working under media laws that restrict what they can report. So, Stuart, what's the significance of this year's commemorations in light of the invasion of Ukraine?
It's known here as the Day of Remembrance and Sorrow. 81 years ago, when the Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union, and it's being commemorated here with a collection in Moscow of veterans who fought in that war, and also people that have been taking part in what Russia calls a special military operation. The defense minister was there to pay his respects, but indeed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Russia was quick to link today's commemoration with the actions it's taking now and the justifications for its actions now in Ukraine. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Maria Zakharova was talking about the Russian military's renewed fight against neo-Nazism, what she's been calling it throughout this whole campaign since February. She says that Russia is intending to free Ukraine from neo-Nazi dominance, fed to the Ukrainians by 3 decades of Western so-called partners. She's equated in her statement on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website the NATO military alliance with the Third Reich. And talking to journalists, she also made a strong link between the status of relations between Germany and Russia, saying that the current actions of the German government are undermining the process of historical reconciliation between Germany and Russia. She said that in word and deed, their actions are jeopardizing the efforts made over these years to try and reconciliate, to overcome post-war enmity. And she talked about an anti-Russia propaganda campaign being launched by the German government. All in all, she didn't hold back. She suggested that the current actions of the German government and military before the as they are now at the western borders of Russia, linking the German military deployment of NATO close to the western borders of Russia. For her, she said, it brings back memories before May 1945, making that link between the actions then and the actions now.
And Stuart, what can you tell us about these possible sanctions against Lithuania, which is involved in this row about the transport of EU goods to Kaliningrad?
Yeah, the spokesperson for the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, spoke about this to journalists on Wednesday. He said that they are taking their time. There is no specific rush to meet any deadlines while they come up with a response to what Russia's calling unfriendly steps, that they are discussing and planning what exactly these repercussions will be for Lithuania, which Russia is focusing on as the enforcer of those EU sanctions. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs provided a little bit of extra detail on Wednesday, saying that these moves will be not diplomatic but practical. It sounds like in line with what the Kaliningrad governor has been saying this week in terms of perhaps mirror trade restrictions on Lithuania, the change in the status of Lithuanian transport companies moving through Kaliningrad, and economic impacts for Lithuania. The Kaliningrad governor, speaking to Russian media, was reassuring both residents there and those in the rest of Russia that so far the latest changes, he says, have not affected the lives of ordinary people in any way, that he expects that in the end Kaliningrad residents will not feel any different than before, with preparations being made to import and export the required goods. He did suggest, though, that the impact for those that are going out and panic buying, that their actions are not required. There will always be supplies, and that although prices may go up, there's no chance of any shortages.
Stuart Smith in Moscow, thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, UK inflation rises to a 40-year high with a warning of worse to come. We'll be looking at the numbers.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. A quick reminder for you that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
UK inflation rose again in May, following on from April's 40-year highs, with fuel prices at record levels and food prices seeing the biggest increase in over a decade. Many households are having to make difficult choices.
And there's a warning that there's worse to come later in the autumn. Well, our business correspondent Juliet Mann has the details. Juliet.
Thank you. Well, the market consensus was spot on. Inflation pushed to a fresh 40-year high of 9.1% in May, and it's expected to rise further still amid the cost of living crisis, hitting 11% as soon as the autumn. Now, most of that due to price rises for food and non-alcoholic drinks, compared with falls in those things a year ago. Prices of dog food, milk and butter are rising the fastest. In fact, grocery inflation has hit a 13-year high at 8.3%. The average UK food bill has risen by $464 a year. And you know what? That's more than $100 above the numbers reported in April. In fact, the UK's grocery trade body said the price rises in the UK could hit 15% this summer. It's the highest level in more than 20 years. And high inflation could last into the middle of next year. Now, last week, the Bank of England raised a few eyebrows when they only moved the base rate up by 25 basis points, while at the same time saying they would act forcefully on inflation if necessary. Just a little reminder, the Bank of England's target rate for inflation is 2%. We're at, 9.1%. Well, Nina Skiro is Chief Executive at the CEBR. Maybe she can help us make head and tail of all this. So, Nina, why is the UK in this vicious cycle, with inflation making the pound weaker, pushing up the price of imports, creating even more inflationary pressure, and we go round again?
The UK certainly finds itself in an unenviable position, but to be fair, a number of other Western economies are grappling with a similar situation. We've similarly seen in the US record-breaking inflation figures, and the Fed there having to take even more decisive action than the Bank of England has. Europe is also facing much higher than than target inflation. So it is really a combination of factors that are impacting much of the world. The part of it comes from the sharp uptick in energy prices, which have an obvious impact on the cost of transport, but also have a trickle-down impact on the cost of a lot of other goods and services, given that energy prices are an input cost for so many sectors. You've also just mentioned food price inflation, which is resulting partially from the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the fact that those two countries are quite big exporters of various food products.
You talk about the US Fed being bolder. Do you think that the Bank of England is then under pressure to raise rates faster?
Some were surprised that in their last meeting, the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, only hiked by 25 points rather than taking more decisive action. There is quite a difficult situation in the moment in a sense that not only is the economy facing high inflation, they are also facing low, in fact, at the moment, negative rates of economic growth. So the Bank of England is clearly trying to balance those two sort of opposing goals, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised to see at least one more and very possibly more hikes before the end of this year.
This rate of inflation could be fatal, couldn't it, for dozens, if not hundreds, of businesses, and there's pressure on the employers in particular to increase wages.
That's right, especially as despite all of the other sort of adverse economic readings, the UK labour market is actually still in a pretty robust position. So there is a lot of pressure on employers to fight for the relatively scarce workers and in fact to try keeping the workers they already have. And this is coming on top of high input prices. And also we've seen a number of pretty broad-based tax hikes in the UK. So it's absolutely fair to say that a lot of businesses, especially SMEs, are being hit by quite a lot of pressures all at once.
And what about you and me and all of our viewers? Because consumers, you know, we're on high alert too. I mean, what impact do you expect this is going to have on consumer confidence?
Consumer confidence is already hitting record lows, and in fact, in recent months, we've seen drops in consumer confidence that are equal to, if not worse, than the drops we saw at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So I think that really tells us how starkly households are being impacted and how seriously everybody's taking this. And we are expecting consumer confidence to remain subdued, along with business confidence, in fact. And there is already data on how consumers are adjusting. So one of the most common things households can do is cut back spending on non-essentials items. So cut back their discretionary spending, which of course creates challenges for a number of consumer-facing industries and the economy as a whole, while others are trying to shop around more or dip into savings, of course, assuming that they have any savings to dip into, which isn't the case for everyone.
Nina Skiro at the CBER, thank you very much. And Jamie and Robin, just a fun fact for you, we're talking about the basket of goods that the Office for National Statistics use to calculate inflation. They've now taken out men's suits and donuts, no longer essential items, it seems.
It's the story of the pandemic, isn't it? No one wears a suit anymore.
Donuts are essential, though. I can't believe that one for a moment.
Juliet, thank you very much.
Now, US stock markets swung from negative to positive after the chair of the Federal Reserve testified on Capitol Hill.
The central bank is tasked with bringing down US inflation, like the UK, also running at a 40-year high. Our correspondent Will Denslow is watching events for us in New York. Will, markets clearly happy then with what Jerome Powell had to say.
That's absolutely right. If we cast our minds back to last week when the Federal Reserve took that extraordinary action by raising interest rates by 0.75%, the biggest rate hike since 1994, we saw a very positive reaction on Wall Street, with investors pleased that the Federal Reserve is taking strong action in a bid to try and get inflation under control here in the United States. There was a similar response, at least in early trading, here on the stock exchange when the markets opened. There was a bounce that then somewhat cooled, and it's really been a choppy start to trading, especially if we look at last check with the markets just up 8 fraction. But there's certainly some positive sentiment coming out of Wall Street off the back of Jerome Powell's comments. What he told lawmakers in the nation's capital is that the Federal Reserve is strongly committed to try and get inflation back under control. He also said that the Federal Reserve has both the tools and the resolve to do so. Of course, the Fed has suggested that there could be another 0.75% rate hike the next time the Open Market Committee meeting convenes next month. He also stressed that there will be a degree of flexibility, very much reiterating comments he made when the Fed convened last week when it comes to adaptability as and when the Fed needs to respond to these price pressures. Let's have a listen.
Making appropriate monetary policy in this uncertain environment requires a recognition that the economy often evolves in unexpected ways. Inflation has obviously surprised to the upside over the past year, and further surprises could be in store. We therefore will need to be nimble in responding to incoming data and the evolving outlook. And we will strive to avoid adding uncertainty in what is already an extraordinarily challenging and uncertain time.
Well, let's talk about oil prices, because they've slumped, haven't they, following comments from President Biden.
Joe, that's absolutely right. What President Biden has said in a statement from the White House, he's calling for action from Congress. And really the aim of that is to what he describes as giving Americans a little breathing room when it comes to the amount people are paying at the gas pump. Now, what the White House is suggesting or urging Congress to do is provide a 3-month tax break when it comes to what the federal and state governments tax for petrol pumps. That would mean that tax at the moment at federal level is 18 cents per litre for gas, 24 cents for diesel. Now, President Biden is also urging individual states to take similar action too. However, this, of course, does need to be ratified by Congress, and there's been some opposition, Jamie, on both sides of the political aisle. There is real concerns from lawmakers that if they were to take such action, then it would simply be the oil companies that essentially take the profits and don't pass that on to consumers. So that is a real concern. There is a huge amount of political volatility when it comes to rising prices, especially with the midterm elections just a couple of months away in the United States. The White House has said that they are taking a number of steps to try and lower gas prices, including the recent announcement of releasing an extra 1 million barrels per day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. But of course, what really matters to consumers here in the US is for those gas prices to start dropping and start dropping substantially.
Will, thank you for that. Our correspondent Will Denslow in New York.
A British subsidiary of the mining firm Glencore has pleaded guilty in a UK court to corruption. It was accused of paying over $28 million in bribes to secure access to crude oil in several African countries between 2012 and 2016. Britain's Serious Fraud Office said Glencore attempted to make illicit profits in 5 African countries. Glencore has also pleaded guilty to corruption charges in the United States and Brazil.
Microsoft is changing its artificial intelligence ethics policy and will no longer provide unrestricted access to its facial recognition technology. Customers will now have to obtain prior approval to use services such as face scans to open doors or log on to websites. The company would also retire its controversial tool that claims to identify emotions from videos and pictures. The feature has been criticised as unscientific.
Britain's RMT union, which represents transport workers, has confirmed that a national rail strike will go ahead on Thursday as planned. It follows a strike on Tuesday, which brought the network to a standstill. Unions say the industrial action is to protest against pay and conditions, while rail bosses are calling on the unions to accept nearly 2,000 job losses.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, roasting in June. Greece is sweltering in an early heat wave, but not everyone is enjoying it.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Warnings of a global economic crisis. Chinese President Xi Jinping hosts the leaders of Russia, Brazil, India and South Africa.
Our other headlines: the worst earthquake in Afghanistan for decades kills over 1,000 people. Many hundreds of others are feared trapped under the rubble.
UK inflation hits 9.1%. Prices are rising at their fastest rate for 40 years. Food, energy and fuel costs are to blame.
The UK's Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab says a British Bill of Rights will strengthen what he calls the country's proud tradition of freedom.
Raab presented proposals in Parliament which could override the powers of the European Court of Human Rights. Earlier this month, the court blocked the government's plan to deport some asylum seekers to Rwanda.
Well, our correspondent Andrew Wilson has been following the story for us. Andrew, tell us more about this bill.
Well, this is something that Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister and also Justice Secretary, has been working on for quite some time. He even wrote a book about it himself 13 years ago. So it's a labour of love as far as he's concerned, and something the opposition have been expecting for quite some time. The UK has always been uncomfortable with Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights, overseeing the way the UK adheres to human rights legislation agreed by all the countries in Europe and beyond. The UK already has its own version of the Bill of Rights, but the government thinks it's now time to modify that, to clarify when judges have to listen to Strasbourg and when they don't, to protect some public bodies like the police or indeed the government from interference by Strasbourg, and more importantly, to give it a mechanism to ignore European Court of Human Rights injunctions, like the one that is underway at the moment, preventing this flight from taking off full of migrants from the UK for the first time to take them to Rwanda, to resettle them there and begin their asylum process there. That's the kind of thing the government wants to prevent. It regards a lot of this human rights legislation as having been stretched over the last couple of decades and badly in need of reform. This was Dominic Raab in the Commons today.
We will also expressly, Mr. Speaker, provide for greater weight to be given to Parliament's determination of the public interest set out in primary legislation when considering the interpretation of rights to ensure we are better equipped to protect the public. And that will reinforce our ability to, for example, deport more foreign national offenders, and in particular, those claiming ever more elastic interpretations of Article 8 and the right to family life to frustrate the deportation process.
Well, the government says this is a way of protecting the people of this country better, giving them more attention from the police, because the police aren't being sidetracked on so many other human rights issues brought about by Strasbourg. The opposition, Amnesty International, various legal groups all vehemently disagree and say that this is the government looking for ways to tighten its own power over the standardised law of human rights, to give it more control and actually take away some of the protections for the poorest members of society. Women who perhaps are struggling with a rape case as victims, or people in care homes struggling with their rights, or people who are victims of some industrial action looking for action against a large public body. These are the people they say are protected by this current human rights legislation, and that the government is trying to whittle this away. Listen to the opposition today in the House of Commons.
It says everything about a Lord Chancellor and a government that is soft on rape, soft on rapists and hard on survivors, that they want to take away the final backstop available to victims to get justice. Women will be in no doubt. This is a government that lets off rapists and lets survivors down, and today is the proof. Mr. Speaker, this bill will see enormous amounts of red tape for victims of crime seeking justice. It's an attack on women, it undermines peace in Northern Ireland, it's the hallmark of a party out of ideas that can no longer govern.
Yeah. So is this bill likely to become law anytime soon?
Well, there's a direction of travel, Jamie. This government, the Conservative Party, have long resented the interference from legal bodies in Europe over UK legislation. This is not a Brexit matter. We're no longer party to European Union laws, but the Convention on Human Rights is something separate. But as you heard from the Labour front bencher there just now, there is a lot of resistance to this. People have seen this coming, and so there will be plenty of argument to be had both in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and even outside in the legal fraternity. But also another problem that Dominic Raab might have was whether or not he's gone too far or not far enough. There are some in the Tory party who would like to see UK actually separate itself altogether from the International Convention on Human Rights. The Deputy Prime Minister doesn't plan to do that, and so there will be a debate within the Tory party as well over whether this is exactly the Bill of Rights that they want to put forward into law. It's going to go on for some time.
Andrew, thanks for that. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson.
After a heatwave struck Western Europe last weekend, Greece is now suffering its first extreme weather of the summer. Greek authorities have warned people to avoid unnecessary work and travel. Our correspondent Evangelos Ipsas reports.
Tourists making their way through Athens' most busy pedestrian area of Ermou, seeking shade and refreshments to ride out Greece's first heat wave of the summer.
Going to the islands, so we'll go swimming and stuff. It will be better, I think, than here in Athens. Yes, and it's windy in the island, so I think it will be better that way as well.
We need to eat light, drink a lot of juices and water, always stay in the shade and follow what the authorities are saying. I'll try to avoid any physical work and stay away from the sun.
The Hellenic National Meteorological Service has warned temperatures are expected to rise close to 40 degrees Celsius, climbing to 42 degrees by the end of the week across large parts of the country. These high temperatures are expected to last over a week. Authorities are advising residents to protect themselves by staying out of direct sunlight, drinking plenty of water, and avoiding heavy physical work. In preparation, Athens has opened 10 air-conditioned spaces for vulnerable groups. Many here in the Greek capital are seeking respite from the scorching weather, heading to any of those air conditioning centers or water fountains, while others head to nearby beaches to cool down. But as high temperatures continue throughout the week, Greeks are worried of the cost of using their air conditioners.
We have to be very careful and not go overboard with spending because of the way things are at the moment. I'm afraid that many others like me would shut our air conditioners for good. From now on, only hand fans.
Across the country, the heat is putting a strain both on health services and power grids. Fire services remain on high alert. As yet, there are no warnings of wildfires, but the danger of such high temperatures is ever present. Evangelos Ipsas for CGTN, Athens.
Europe needs to be prepared for a total shutdown of Russian gas exports this winter. That's the warning from the International Energy Agency.
The organisation's chief says that Moscow will look to increase its leverage in the colder winter months and that governments must take measures to cut demand.
Well, our correspondent Ross Cullen is in Paris. So, Ross, what sort of action is the IEA suggesting?
Well, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is headquartered here in Paris, did say that when it comes to the clean energy transition, we are seeing increased investment in countries, but it is almost exclusively by advanced economies. He said we are seeing it in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, China, but there needs to be more help for advancing economies, for those emerging nations to be able to meet their climate goals, to meet their clean energy transition targets. He also did say that when it comes to the size of the world's energy industry, some $4 trillion, there are likely to be windfall revenues for oil and gas producing countries. Fatih Birol, who's the executive director of the International Energy Agency, made a recommendation to those countries saying that you should be reinvesting that revenue back into your own economy, to diversify your economy and also to delink yourself from being tied to oil and gas prices.
And Ross, the IEA saying that emergency measures we've seen so far haven't gone far enough.
No, Robin, they haven't gone far enough. They are not strong enough at the moment, according to the IEA. These climate measures, these clean energy transition policies that countries have put into place, they are not strong enough to lift us out of our current crisis and also to lift us towards that aspiration that the IEA has of a cleaner, better future. We did hear Fatih Birol regularly say, I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record. We've been making these recommendations from the IEA to governments for many years now. We've been sounding alarm bells in previous years, more alarm bells, he said, in this current report. He also did mention coal, saying that we are seeing an increased investment in that fossil fuel linked to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There's a 10% increase in coal investment this year. 2023, he said, we're likely to not see a reversal, either the same level investment or even increased investment by countries in coal in 2023. We also heard from the chief energy economist at the International Energy Agency, Tim Gould. He was saying that something has to happen. Something has to give, he was saying, Robin, to bring us out of these current crises, because otherwise we're going to be off track when it comes to net zero emissions targets in 2050.
Ross, thanks very much. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Saudi's Crown Prince in Turkey. His first visit since diplomatic relations soured after the murder of a high-profile Saudi critic.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country. There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN. Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince is in Turkey on his first trip to the country since the murder of the dissident Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul 4 years ago.
Mohammed bin Salman has been meeting Turkey's President Erdogan in a bid to repair relations between the two nations. It follows talks between the two leaders in Riyadh in April.
Well, CGTN's Louise Greenwood has been following the story. Louise, relations between Turkey and Saudi have been in difficulties for years now. Just how significant is this visit?
It's hugely significant, Jamie. One unnamed Turkish official said it was an attempt by Ankara for a full normalisation of relations with the Saudi regime. Now, as you say, these have been in a pretty dire state even before the killing of Khashoggi in Istanbul in 2018. He'd been attending the Saudi consul to pick up some documentation to prepare for his forthcoming marriage and was never seen alive again after entering the building. Now, at the time, Saudi denied any knowledge of exactly what had happened to him. But later, it said that it was the killing had been the work of a dissident group of Saudi agents operating in the country. But it stopped short of actually naming Prince bin Salman as being part of this plot. Now, Ankara and Riyadh have been at loggerheads since the Arab Spring movement began in 2011. It's perceived support by Turkey for these factions backed by the Muslim Brotherhood across the Middle East that's really angered the royal dynasties of the Gulf states. The blockade of Qatar in 2017, that marked another low point. So today's visit very much a sea change, described by one Turkish official as a return to pre-crisis conditions for Ankara.
Well, let's cut to the chase. What are both sides hoping to gain from today's trip?
Well, essentially, it's a complete reset centred around trade links as well as a diplomatic boost for Turkey in its former Ottoman territories across the Middle East. Well, since 2018, Ankara's been pursuing a policy of mending fences with its neighbours across the region. What's changed? Well, we're in a very different world now, of course. We're seeing the inflationary threat. The US is trying to also repair its ties with Riyadh. It wants to see the country start pumping more oil to ease global growth. President Biden is due to visit Riyadh himself before too long. And in Turkey, very particular problems. We've got this official rise in the cost of borrowing at over 70%. Some think that the true rate is an awful lot higher. And Ankara particularly is looking for trade deals, but also a possible currency swap with Saudi, with the Saudi Riyal that would take some heat off of the Turkish lira in the run-up to the next election. That's, of course, halved in value since early last year. Now, Saudi, in turn, is looking for defence contracts, particularly a deal to buy Bayraktar drones, these very powerful so-called flag-bearing drones. These were developed by Turkey back in 2014 to combat the Kurdish threat in the southeast of the country. But since then, they've been used in conflicts from Syria to Libya, against Armenian forces in Nagorno-Karabakh, and most recently now, as we've seen, to pretty devastating effect against Russian troops on the ground in Ukraine.
OK, Louise, we have to leave it there. Thanks for that. CGTN's Louise Greenwood.
Hundreds of thousands of people in China have been moved from their homes in southern and eastern provinces after heavy rain caused floods and landslides. Schools, offices and public transport were suspended in the key manufacturing hub of Guangdong. Roads, cars and homes were swept away in some cities. More rainfall is expected in the coming days.
United States senators from both parties have reached an agreement on a gun violence bill after recent mass shootings. It's a step towards the first serious gun control legislation in decades. The bill, which includes more background checks for the youngest buyers and tougher penalties for gun traffickers, will be voted on later this week.
A passenger plane has slid off the runway and caught fire after a crash landing at Miami International Airport in the United States. The plane was seen skidding on its belly after reports of a failure of its landing gear. 126 people were on the flight from the Dominican Republic. 3 were taken to hospital with minor injuries.
The polio virus may be spreading in the UK for the first time in nearly 40 years, as health officials declared a national incident and urged people to make sure they're vaccinated. The virus has been found in a number of sewage samples in London. Parents are being warned to make sure their children are immunised. Britain was declared free of polio in 2003.
Airline executives, plane makers and aviation enthusiasts have come together in Berlin for the city's International Air Show.
It's one of the biggest events of its kind in Europe and comes as airlines and airports try to solve staffing shortages ahead of what's expected to be a busy summer holiday season. Our correspondent Trent Murray reports.
Descending into Berlin's Brandenburg International Airport, some of the biggest names in global aviation. The biannual Berlin Air Show is on again after a 4-year hiatus caused by COVID. The get-together coming as the industry experiences a big bounce back in post-pandemic travel. Like many airports across Europe, BER says its staff shortages are likely to lead to ongoing disruptions to the coming summer holidays.
We will have a difficult summer. Parallel, the companies at the airport, they are staffing, but everyone working on the airport have to pass the security checks, and this will last 4 to 8 weeks. So maybe they are really staffed after the summer.
For plane makers, the surge in passengers is proving good for business. Many saying they're feeling confident about the future of travel.
Travel is coming back in most parts of the world, and that is a positive sign for the industry. The industry is struggling on a couple of issues on the supply chain, but they will solve it. The other thing which is very, very much at the forefront of this show is everything which is related to environment. And that's be that the fuels which are used, be that the procedures which are used, all that is like the buzz of this air show.
This air show has always had a strong focus on civilian aviation, but there is a noticeable uptick in defence and military contractors this time around. The war in Ukraine is causing much of Europe to have a fresh look at what parts of their military need modernising. The German government has earmarked over $100 billion in new military spending in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Much of that will be spent on air defences. But before signing on the dotted line, there's tough competition among defence firms to prove their kit can do the job, with potential customers getting an opportunity for an up-close look. With more passengers cleared for takeoff post-COVID, the world's flight paths are getting busy once more, and the industry says it's ready to help, despite any headwinds that may be yet to come. Trent Murray, CGTN, Berlin.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. All the team in London. Goodbye.
Goodbye.